Hello, and welcome to the next reading from John Wesley Evangelist by Skevington Wood. We're in part 2, and today's reading is chapter 9, In the Same Track, it's entitled, and from the works of John Wesley, I assume it's book 13, page 343. From this time, I have, by the grace of God, gone in the same track, travelling between 4,000 and 5,000 miles a year, and once in 2 years going through Great Britain and Ireland. The stage was now set for Wesley to embark on the wider mission which was to occupy him for the rest of his life. What had been begun in Bristol and continued in London could be extended to the country as a whole. This new method of field preaching opened up a vast potential. Wesley stood poised to spread scriptural holiness over the land. That was his own distinctive description of his aim. Everything was ready for him to pursue it. He was quite clear to the content of the gospel which he had been ordained to preach, and he had confirmed it in his own experience, explains Rupert Davis. He had tried out his methods of preaching it and confirming it in the lives of those to whom he preached in Bristol and London. The situation with which he had been confronted in those two cities had shown how great was the need which the gospel was designed to meet. Henceforth, no diocesan or episcopal rule was going to prevent him from doing what he conceived to be his plain duty. The evangelist was eager to be about his business. His parish knew no boundaries. It is significant that the famous letter to James Hervey, in which Wesley announced that the world was his parish, was written on the 20th of March, 1739. This was before he had been to Kingswood and started his open-air experiment. But already he was prepared in mind and spirit for the step into no man's land. He was determined not to be restricted by ecclesiastical barriers. Hervey had inquired how Wesley could justify the invasion of other men's parishes upon Catholic principles. It was a characteristic of Anglican evangelicals like Hervey to adhere to the parochial system. Wesley's reply is a classic one. Permit me to speak plainly. If by Catholic principles you mean any other than scriptural, they weigh nothing with me. I allow no other rule, whether of faith or practice, than the Holy Scriptures. But on scriptural principles I do not think it hard to justify whatever I do. God in Scripture commands me, according to my power, to instruct the ignorant, reform the wicked, confirm the virtuous. Man forbids me to do this in another's parish. That is, in effect, to do it at all. Seeing I have now no parish of my own, nor probably ever shall, whom then shall I hear, God or man? If it be just to obey man rather than God, judge you. A dispensation of the gospel is committed to me, and woe is me if I preach not the gospel. But where shall I preach it? Upon the principles you mention. Wesley went on to show that if he were to limit himself like this, he would have no scope, in any of the Christian parts at least, of the habitable earth, for all these are, after a sort, divided into parishes. And then in words which represent the Magna Charta of evangelism, Wesley declared his intention. Suffer me now to tell you my principles in this matter. I look upon all the world as my parish. Thus far I mean that in whatever part of it I am, I judge it meet, right, and my bounden duty to declare unto all that are willing to hear the glad tidings of salvation. This is the work which I know God has called me to, and sure I am that his blessing attends it. Great encouragement have I, therefore, to be faithful in fulfilling the work he hath given me to do. His servant I am, and as such am employed according to the plain direction of his word, as I have opportunity, doing good unto all men. And his providence clearly concurs with his word, which has disengaged from me all things else, that I might singly attend on this very thing, and go about doing good. So, on the 23rd of June, Wesley wrote more briefly but on similar lines to his brother Charles. He met the objection that he must submit to the ordinances of the church by accepting any that might be contrary to the will of God. If any man, bishop or other, ordain that I shall not do what God commands me to do, to submit to that ordinance would be to obey man rather than God. He distinguished between his ordinary call received at his episcopal ordination and his extraordinary call to evangelize the people, which came direct from God. God bears witness in an extraordinary manner that my thus exercising my ordinary call is well pleasing in his sight. But what if a bishop forbids this? I do not say, as St. Cyprian, populus e seclerato antistite separare se debit, the people ought to separate themselves from a wicked bishop. But I say, God being my helper, I will obey him still, and if I suffer for it, his will be done. This was the unequivocal position Wesley was unafraid to maintain even in the presence of a bishop. In August 1739, according to a document preserved by Dr. John Whitehead, Wesley had an interview with the Bishop of Bristol, who was none other than Dr. Joseph Butler, author of the celebrated Analogy of Religion. The incident is not recorded in the journal, but in the account mentioned above, the bishop concluded by saying, "Since you ask my advice, I will give it you very freely. You have no business here. You are not commissioned to preach in this diocese. Therefore, I advise you to go hence." Wesley stoutly replied, "My lord, my business on earth is to do what good I can. Wherever, therefore, I think I can do most good, there I must stay, so long as I think so. At present, I think I can do most good here. Therefore, here I stay. As to my preaching here, a dispensation of the gospel is committed to me. And woe is me if I preach not the gospel wherever I am in the habitable world. Your lordship knows, being ordained a priest by the commission I then received, I am a priest of the Church Universal. And being ordained as fellow of a college, I was not limited to any particular cure, but have an indeterminate commission to preach the word of God in any part of the Church of England." That's from his journal, volume 2. And this was probably on 18th of August, and was the second audience Wesley had with the bishop, the first being on 16th of August. Butler had been elevated to the See of Bristol in 1738. R.E. Davis mistakenly places the interview with the bishop before Wesley's letter to Hervey. With this inalienable divine authorization, Wesley calmly proceeded to implement his call by pressing on with his mission regardless of what diocesan bishops or parochial clergy must say. He moved in the realm of the spirit where man-made fences must fall. For the residue of his days he was to give himself without stint to this work of God. He journeyed throughout the length and breadth of the land. He registered an incredible annual mileage when we consider the conditions under which he travelled. And, as Augustine Beryl put it, he contested the three kingdoms in the cause of Christ during a campaign which lasted for 50 years. From Beryl's selected essays, 1884 to 1907, published in 1909. Although Wesley's critics were alarmed at what appeared to be an innovation, and to them a distasteful one at that, There was in fact ample and honourable precedence for itinerant evangelism. Indeed, this was the means by which Britain was missioned in the first place. The indigenous British church, planted it may be through Roman soldiers, had few buildings, and the early emissaries of the cross had no alternative but to preach in the open. The pioneer missionary enterprise of Ninian and Patrick in the 5th century, and of Columba in the 6th, falls largely into this category. The southern Roman mission under Augustine of Canterbury was inaugurated as Ethelbert, King of Kent, listened to the message in the open air, and the good news was often spread in the same manner. And actually it was for fear of magic that Ethelbert refused to hear Augustine under cover, from Frank M. Stenton's Anglo-Saxon England, published in 1943. The conversion of Northumbria under Paulinus and Aidan was achieved in part by this means. Bede tells us that the latter was accustomed to traverse both town and country on foot, never on horseback, unless compelled by some urgent necessity. And wherever in his way he saw any either rich or poor, he invited them, if infidels, to embrace the mystery of the faith. From Bede's book, The Ecclesiastical History of the English Nation, published by John Stevens, I think it's the Evangelical Times, in 1910, Book 3, Chapter 5, page 110. Another pedestrian evangelist of this period was Chad, a pupil of Aidan at Lindisfarne, who first as Abbot of Lastingham, and then as Bishop of Lichfield, preached the gospel in towns and in the open countryside, in castles and cottages, with unabated zeal. And that's from Bede's book, aforementioned book 4, chapter 3. The coming of the friars in the 13th century saw a renaissance of itinerant outdoor preaching. In 1224, the Grey Friars of St. Francis arrived in England, and we can picture them as they moved about the land with true gospel simplicity. In a habit of coarse brown cloth, a long pointed hood, a short cloak, a girdle of knotted cord round their waists, and no shoes or sandals to protect their feet, they trudged the dusty lanes of summer and the muddy tracks of winter. These religious roundsmen, as G.M. Trevelyan dubbed them, were always on the move and never tired of exalting Christ. That's from Trevelyan's book, English Social History, published in 1944. Although their provenance was different, they nevertheless paved the way for Wycliffe's Lollards in the following century, and it is not altogether certain whether the Lollards were actually commissioned by Wycliffe himself. K.B. Macfarlane thinks they may have been dispatched by some of the younger hotheads left behind at Oxford by Wycliffe, and that's from the book John Wycliffe and the Beginnings of English Nonconformity, 1952. These travelling preachers were the heralds of the Reformation, for they attacked the abuses of the Roman Church long before Luther, but their chief object was to proclaim the gospel in the language of the people. Clad in russet robes down to their bare feet, with staff in hand and no purse from which to buy provisions, they relied on such food and shelter as was offered to them. They preached wherever they could get a hearing, sometimes in churches, but more often on the village green or by the roadside. The same tradition of preaching in the open was carried on at the time of the English Reformation by the Scottish Covenanters and by George Fox and the early Quakers. When Wesley started to compass the land, therefore, he was in good company. He could claim that history vindicated his venture, but he was more concerned with the present and with the future. He was convinced that the only way of rousing the nation to the things of the Spirit was to extend the method with which he had experimented in Bristol and London to the entire country. His goal was a mission to the masses. Like any shrewd military commander, he knew that a base was of prime importance. If he was to attack the land as a whole, he must first plant himself in secure headquarters. London was the obvious choice. Already he had supporters there in the Fetter Lane Society, and he was quick to ensure that they came under his direct control. A dispute with the Moravians about the doctrine of stillness, which in itself was unfortunate, in effect turned out to be a disguised blessing. It afforded an opportunity to establish the first exclusively Methodist society. Malthus' teaching was no part of official Moravian belief, and no doubts the breach could have been healed. But in terms of Wesley's mission, it was better to separate. In July 1740, at a Sunday evening love feast, Wesley withdrew with 18 or 19 followers. That's from Journal Volume 2, 20th of July 1739. Philip Henry Malther, an Alsatian who had been influenced by Zinzendorf, was in London on his way to missionary work in Pennsylvania. His teaching on stillness was intended as a curb on undue emotionalism and a warning against reliance on ordinances and piety. As Towson explains, though there was something of truth in Malthus' general position, for there is a vague ethicalism which seeks to achieve salvation by philanthropy, and worse, a fussiness in performing church duties which only hides spiritual poverty, he spoiled his case by exaggerating it. From this juncture, Methodists and Moravians went their several ways, each continuing to further the revival, though not now in harness together. It was not, however, until 2 years later that Fetter Lane actually became a Moravian congregation. Although it was dominated by Moravian influences, especially after Wesley's withdrawal, it remained until 1742 what it had been from the start, namely a religious society connected with the Church of England. From John S. Simon's book John Wesley and the Methodist Societies, published in 1923. The withdrawal from Fetter Lane, however, was a final and calculated step in a series of moves to dissociate Wesley's disciples from the sleeping sickness of Malthus' false doctrine. In his earnest appeal to men of reason and religion in 1744, he disclosed something which is not recorded in his journal. In November 1739, two gentlemen, then unknown to me, Mr. Ball and Mr. Watkins, came and desired me once and again to preach in a place called the Foundry near Moorfields. With much reluctance I at length complied. I was soon after pressed to take that place into my own hands. Those who were most earnest therein lent me the purchase money, which was a quite princely sum of £115. When you consider Charles Wesley, I believe, was on £10 a year. That would have been 15 years' wages for Charles Wesley and other ministers. So where am I up to? That was point 3. Whitehead believed that Wesley, disturbed by the situation at Fetter Lane, was already contemplating a separation. That's John Whitehead's book, The Life of the Reverend John Wesley, published in 1793. It looks as if the entry in the journal for Christmas Day 1739 might mark the first meeting of the new society at the Foundry. After spending part of the night at Fetter Lane, Wesley then went to a smaller company, where also we exhorted one another with hymns and spiritual songs, and poured out our hearts to God in prayer. Of course, this is only conjectural, but it is clear that early in 1740 a society was meeting at the Foundry under Wesley's supervision. Charles took charge on occasion in his brother's absence. From Frederick Gill's Charles Wesley, published in 1964, and incidentally, I am thinking of following this series of John Wesley Evangelist by reading Arnold Dullimore's excellent biography of Charles Wesley. It is from him that we learn that by June 1740 there were 300 members, so that the handful who walked out of Fetter Lane in the following month are not to be thought of as constituting the nucleus of a brand new group. If we still accept the 23rd of July 1740 as the date when the first Methodist Society met in completed separation from the Moravians, we must bear these other factors in mind and recognise that in reality the break had begun sooner. The building at the Foundry was no more than a shell when Wesley bought it. It had been used for casting cannon until a severe explosion in 1716. From that time it had been left derelict. Although he was able to buy the lease for a modest sum, nearly £700 was spent on repairs and alterations to equip it not only as a meeting place for the society, but also as the headquarters of the mission. It was for this purpose that accommodation was provided for Wesley himself when he returned to London from his tours. There was also a book room to house the Christian literature to be distributed throughout the country, and stables for the preacher's horses. Here was Wesley's pied-à-terre, from which he directed the entire campaign. Whilst he was in his journeyings, as he was for most of the year, this was the clearing-house for correspondence. Until City Road Chapel was opened in 1778, the foundry formed the operational base. Wesley might well have taken on his lips the reputed cry of Archimedes, which he does indeed quote in his journal, "Give me a place to stand, and I will move the earth." And the exact words of Archimedes were, "Give me a lever long enough, and a fulcrum strong enough, and single-handed I can move the world." From Pliny's Historia Naturalis, Book 8, Volume 7, page 37. The track which he came to follow in his itinerations was in the first place triangular. Already he had London as his centre and Bristol as his second major city. The new room in the Horse Fair there was built even before the foundry. In 1742, a year of expansion, the third point of the triangle was fixed at Newcastle upon Tyne. Here the Orphan House opened in 1743, served as a kind of northern office, as well as a favourite retreat for Wesley when exhausted by his travels. This, then, was the grand plan of the national mission. It was through John Nelson that Wesley was drawn to the north. The Yorkshire stonemason was converted in London, and had then returned to his home in Bristol to evangelise the district. He begged Wesley to visit him and to support the crusade by preaching. Wesley reached Bristol on the 26th of May 1742, and was astonished at what he saw. Many of the greatest profligates in all the country were now changed. Their blasphemies were turned to praise. Many of the most abandoned drunkards were now sober. Many Sabbath breakers remembered the Sabbath to keep it holy. The whole town wore a new face. Such a change did God work by the artless testimony of one plain man. From his Works, Volume 13, A Short History of the People Called Methodists, 1781. Wesley himself preached on the top of Bristol Hill to several hundreds of plain people, and spent the afternoon in talking severally with those who had tasted of the grace of God. In the evening he preached on the side of Dewsbury Moor, about 2 miles away. This initial ministry in the north bore immediate fruit. Amongst those who heard him were Nathaniel Harrison and John Murgatroyd, two stalwarts of Methodism in that area in days to come. Next morning, Wesley took leave of Nelson and rode further north with his companion John Taylor. On Friday the 28th of May they arrived on the outskirts of Newcastle upon Tyne. It was the Countess of Huntingdon who had urged Wesley to go there and bring the gospel to the colliers and keelmen. He had called at her home at Donington Park near Ashby de la Zouch before continuing into Yorkshire. After taking a meal, Wesley and Taylor walked through the town. I was surprised. So much drunkenness, cursiness and swearing, even from the mouths of little children, do I never remember to have seen and heard before in so small a compass of time. Surely this place is right for him, who came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Such was Wesley's immediate reaction. Sunday saw the start of his evangelistic thrust. At 7 in the morning he went down Sandgate, the poorest and most contemptible part of the town. That's from the 30th of May 1742. And taking his stance at the end of the street along with Taylor, struck up the 100th Psalm. 3 or 4 people came to see what was happening. Soon there were 300 or 400 curious bystanders. Then Wesley gave a message on Isaiah 53 verse 5, and before he had finished the crowd had grown to almost 1,500. The people still stood there after he had closed the service, gaping and staring in their astonishment at such an unusual sight. Wesley, in his matter-of-fact way, made the briefest of announcements. "If you desire to know who I am, my name is John Wesley. At 5 in the evening, with God's help, I design to preach here again." And with that, he left them. Tyerman has graphically pieced together the elements in this drama which inaugurated Wesley's work in the third of his key centres. The preacher, the renowned John Wesley, doubtless dressed in full canonicals, with plain John Taylor standing at his side, the time 7 o'clock on a Sunday morning in the beautiful month of May, the place Sandgate, crowded with keelmen and sailors, using, says Christopher Hopper, the language of hell as though they had received a liberal education in the regions of woe. The song of praise, the old 100th Psalm, which, like the grand old ocean, is as fresh and as full of music now as it was when it first was written, and the text, the very pith of gospel truth. He was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities, the chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. And Christopher Hopper in Wesleyan Methodist magazine said a granite obelisk and drinking trough now marks the site of Wesley's first preaching in Newcastle. It is a scene etched so vividly that as we read of it, we seem to be there ourselves. In the evening, the numbers had swelled to incredible proportions. In Moorfields and on Kennington Common, Wesley had faced congregations of up to 20,000, but this was more than he had ever seen. Afterwards, the poor people were ready to tread him underfoot, out of pure love and kindness. It was some time before he could get away. When he reached his inn, he found a deputation waiting to press him to remain, but he had promised to be back in Bristol, and so was compelled to leave. But from that day on, Newcastle was a regular stopping place, and some of his most rewarding work was done there. Not many miles away was Houghton-the-Spring, where, in the days of the Reformation, Bernard Gilpin was rector. He was known as the Apostle of the North, as he travelled far and wide in the neglected parishes, preaching the everlasting gospel. Wesley was called in his century to follow in the steps of Gilpin, whose life he read when in Georgia. And Gilpin came under the influence of Erasmus's writings at Queen's College, Oxford. He was outspoken in advocating a reformation of clerical standards. The north of England figures prominently in his subsequent itineraries, Leeds and Manchester being added to Newcastle, as springboards from which to evangelise whole areas. Wesley's route back from the north was planned to bring him, after many years, once again to Ebworth. The story of how he preached on his father's tombstone is too familiar to repeat. He had been refused permission to preach in the church by the curate John Romley, and the rector was the Honourable John Hay. The crowd outside was considerable. No doubt the people came from many other places. It was a wonderful scene, commented Dean Hutton, one of the most moving in the history of the church. It is reproduced on the marble memorial to Wesley in Westminster Abbey. That was the first of many visits to Epworth, where he always seemed to draw a crowd and see results. In many ways, 1742 was Wesley's annus mirabilis, so far as breaking new ground was concerned. He reports that in this year many societies were formed in Somersetshire, Wiltshire, Gloucestershire, Leicestershire, Warwickshire, Nottinghamshire, as well as the southern parts of Yorkshire. In the following year, he was able to map out a definite plan, spending about 14 weeks in London, 10 in Bristol and district, 13 in and about Newcastle, 3 in Cornwall, and 12 elsewhere, chiefly in the Midlands and North. As Tyerman remarked, he was now a thorough itinerant. From the Life of John Wesley, Volume 1, from Tyerman's book. Wesley was not confined to England. He had gone into Wales in October 1739 and found most of the inhabitants indeed ripe for the gospel. but he was content to leave Howell Harris to push forward with the evangelisation of the Principality. His first trip to Ireland was in August 1747, and 20 more were to come. This was a particularly encouraging sphere. The overall picture is of triumphal progress, writes F.C. Gill. Never since the days of St. Patrick had Ireland known such flaming evangelism or greeted a more fervent apostle. The soldiers to whom he preached in Athlone barracks declared there was something superhuman about him. Thus from Frederick Gill's In the Steps of John Wesley, published in 1962. His farewell in 1789 was quite an ovation, according to Canon Overton. In April 1751, Wesley crossed the Scottish border for the first time. He made 22 visits in all, the last being as late as 1790. He was there from the 11th to the 31st of May 1790. He was always received with the utmost courtesy and had the support of distinguished ministers in the Kirk. His influence in Scotland lay not so much in the establishment of Methodist societies, of which there were comparatively few, but in quickening the existing life of Presbyterianism. And that's Dugald Butler's John Wesley and George Whitfield in Scotland, published in 1898. The Isle of Man was not reached until 1777, and the Channel Islands later still in 1787. He was in the Isle of Man on the 30th of July 1777, and the Channel Islands 15th of August 1787. We have done no more than touch and glance on the broad outlines of Wesley's travel plan. To go into detail would demand a book in itself, for, as Dr. V. H. Green, in his book John Wesley, has strikingly observed, the places that Wesley visited make his journal an evangelical Bradshaw. And in all Bradshaw, that is Bradshaw's Railway Guide. And in all his widespread journeyings, he had only one desire. It was to lead men and women to Christ. His motive was as simple as that. Evidently John Smith had accused him of assuming the apostolate of England. Wesley replied that he no more did that than he assumed the apostolate of all Europe, or rather of all the world. That is, in plain terms, wherever I see 1 or 1,000 men running into hell, be it in England, Ireland, or France, yea, in Europe, Asia, Africa, or America, I will stop them, if I can, as a minister of Christ. I will beseech them in his name to turn back and be reconciled to God. Were I to do otherwise, were I to let any soul drop into the pit, whom I might have saved from everlasting burnings, I am not satisfied. God would accept my plea, Lord, he was not of my parish. That's from a letter to John Smith on the 22nd of March 1748. Wesley knew that his journeys were really necessary, and he could point to the results for ample proof. In June 1755, he paused to weigh the facts. From a deep sense of the amazing work which God has of late years wrought in England, I preached in the evening on those words, Psalm 147, verse 20, He hath not dealt so with any nation. No, not even in Scotland or New England. In both these God has indeed made bare his arm, yet not in so astonishing a manner as among us. This must appear to all who impartially consider 1. The number of persons on whom God has wrought, 2. The swiftness of his work in many, both convinced and truly converted in a few days, 3. The depth of it in most of these, changing the heart as well as the conversations, 4. The clearness of it, enabling them boldly to say, Thou hast loved me, thou hast given thyself for me. 5. The continuance of it. God has wrought in Scotland and New England at several times for some weeks or months together, but among us he has wrought for near 18 years together, without any observable intermission. Above all, let it be remarked that a considerable number of the regular clergy were engaged in that great work in Scotland, and in New England, above 100, perhaps as eminent as any in the whole province, not only for piety, but also for abilities, both natural and acquired. Whereas in England there were only 2 or 3 inconsiderable clergymen, with a few young, raw, unlettered men, and these opposed by well-nigh all the clergy, as well as laity, in the nation, he that remarks this must needs own both that this is a work of God, and that he hath not wrought so in any other nation. That's from the 16th of June 1755 in his journal, volume 4. By 1785, Wesley could claim that the number of those who had been brought to God in the revival was perhaps greater than in any other age since the time of the Apostles, and who can deny the possibility? At his death in 1791, there were 72,000 members in his own societies alone in Great Britain, apart from those overseas. By the grace of God, Wesley was enabled to go on in the same track, and it proved to be a trail of untold blessing. So next week, God willing, we'll look at chapter 10. In part 2, there is another, after chapter 10, there is another 8 chapters to go in the second part of the book, and the title for chapter 10 is This Vagabond Life. And yes, it's about 9 pages. These chapters usually are about 9 pages, 9 or 10 pages, sometimes 11. So until then, as always, may God bless you all. Amen.